So back when I was in the remediation business as a environmental engineer, one of the things we had to identify with each report is what was the pathway. Now there are different pathways into the body, but there's three primary ones. The first one is inhalation, meaning that whatever the contaminant is, it goes in through the nose, into the lungs, and out through the body and the bloodstream that way. That's called the inhalation pathway. Then you have the ingestion pathway, and then you have skin absorption, dermal absorption. And in this case, lead is, can be breathed in to a certain extent into the lungs if you have dusts, but the vast majority of the contamination is going to happen from children that are eating something. And maybe they're rolling their balls in lead-based paint, and then they're eating the balls or licking the balls or that sort of thing. And that's the pathway for the children to be getting that sort of stuff into their system. By contrast, I'd mentioned mothers. If a mother has a lot of lead in her system, there's going to be fertility and digestive issues. And so, then the question becomes, well, how is the mother ingesting that lead? And that becomes a little bit more difficult because the mother obviously isn't going to be rolling balls, she's not going to be eating dirt, she's not going to be doing a lot of those things, so it has to be another pathway, or not another pathway because it's all ingestive, but another manner for that lead to get into her system. And we're going to talk about some of the manners that that lead can find its way into even an adult. I'd mentioned you can have dust in the lungs. I understand that using lead-based pots and pans does actually cause the food to taste better, but apparently it had some side effects that aren't very good. Then you have what I consider to be, for those of us that are living in the year 2000 and some change, probably, and especially for children, the greatest pathway is eating, like I say, eating dirt or eating something that has lead on it. And I have a couple of stories that illustrate that. One of them is I did an inspection at a pretty new home. It was less than a year old, and checked out pretty well, and I left. I wrote the report, and I get another call 2 or 3 weeks later, and they said our living room is soaked. And they thought I'd totally screwed up, and I couldn't figure out what had happened because, So I made the courtesy return, and I went into their home, and sure enough, that living room was soaked. And this is a brand new home, so the roof didn't leak, the sprinklers weren't hitting the house. The entire living room, pretty much half of it, was very wet, to the point that as I was crawling around trying to find the source, I was getting my hands wet, I was getting my elbows wet, I was getting my knees wet. And what I noticed at first is that the carpet was more wet than the pad, and the pad was more wet than the slab, because we didn't have a basement, we had a slab. And so I thought, all right, we're not getting the water from beneath, we're not getting it from the window, we're not getting it from the ceiling. I went out and looked at the roof, and there was anything that was going on here. And this was a living room where there's no water. This was actually where a bunch of children were being cared for. It was kind of a daycare of sorts. I don't know if it was licensed, but we had a half dozen kids there. And the toy box was pretty much in the center of the wetness. So I started looking around for other sources of water, and then I noticed this puppy. And it was one of those 5-pound yapper types. And I said, how long have you had that dog? And they said, well, it only comes here occasionally. As I was leaving, at this point I'm suspecting that the wetness is urine, and I went to go get a black light so that I could see if it was urine, and while I was gone, they called me up and says, it's the dog. So, the gross thing is that we actually did have children rolling balls and sitting down and playing and having blocks and toys that they were chewing, and that was dog urine. And turns out the dog was peeing on the carpet to try and cover the cat pee that was there with the previous occupants. Disgusting. But this is the pathway for children to get that sort of contamination into their system. Similarly, my own daughter once, I have three, and one of my daughters, as she was very little, right after she found out how to walk, every time I turned my head, she would run outside and shovel as much dirt into her mouth as she could get. And at the time I was working as an environmental engineer, and I thought, man, I'm glad we're not working in another part of town where there's higher heavy metal contents, because she could be damaging herself with the heavy metals. You know, I don't know what was in that soil. I'm sure it wasn't good for her, but at least there wasn't heavy metals in there. Had there been, you know, maybe, you know, there's a joke I use about, you know, maybe that would explain some things, but actually she turned into a very intelligent young lady, doing very well. So whatever her successes or failures are, it doesn't appear to have been associated with her eating dirt.